So let's talk about a few individual units and datasheets that most need Games Workshop's help in the upcoming Warhammer 40k Baance Pass. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k balance updates once more, with a look at just a small selection of units that really could use Games Workshop's help when the next points and rules changes happen. As per a recent MetaWatch article focusing on Kill Team, Games Workshop said that they'd be back in the next few weeks to be talking about some Warhammer 40k points changes, and that does mean that we're kind of likely to see a points update sometime, I'd say in the next 1 to 3 weeks from now. They often tend to drop on Thursdays, and it could be an excuse to drop them at the same time as the Custodians and Orcs new points perhaps. We might see something as early as next week, though it could be either of the weeks after that. Basically Games Workshop's quarterly changes to balance in Warhammer 40k. As ever, they'll certainly be looking to shore up the strength of some entire factions. There's plenty of armies that have their tournament win rates down really quite low at the moment, and hopefully they'll see some improvements either with rules or with points changes if that doesn't happen. So far we know that points changes definitely are happening, though they haven't 100% confirmed that they're going to be making rules changes via a balanced data slate, though so far in 10th edition they have chosen to update that each time they've done a balance pass, though it doesn't necessarily mean that they will for this one. They might be saving those changes till maybe later in the year. For the purposes of this video though, I thought it could be interesting just to take a look at a few individual units, just some examples out of some factions that could really use a points boost, maybe more for internal balance more than anything else, why they might be struggling and not really working at the moment, and perhaps for a few of them whether or not they might be better fixed by points or rules changes. This one's definitely not aimed to be an exhaustive list or anything like that, just a few options that came to mind. Let me know what else you'd like to see addressed for your given faction down in the comments. Jumping right in though, and first up to talk about the Space Marines, there's the Tactical Marines, currently 160 points for a 10 model squad. The Firstborn Troops choice generally hasn't had all that much competitive success in the general history of Warhammer 40k, and it seems that now is currently no exception. These guys are kind of unfortunately locked to being bought in 10 model buy-ins, meaning it's not quite as easy just to get 5 of them in an army if that's how many points you have left over. And while you do have their combat squad rule to split the unit, which I guess is kind of appropriate for their lore, tactical flexibility and everything like that, it just basically means they have that option to be able to be fielded as smaller units the same as any other Space Marine unit does. So it really doesn't feel like you're gaining much to me. It just means that that rule sort of takes precedent over another special rule that they might have had. Say for example it meant that they lost that fall back and shoot type rule that they had pre-Codex. Otherwise at the moment they cost the exact same as Primaris intercessors but have a lot of disadvantages. Their melee's worse by 1 attack both on the regular guys and on the sergeant with a power fist. They don't get that objective secured sticky objectives type rule that the intercessors have, which is genuinely handy enough to have around. Their bolters don't get any AP, and the bolters don't get the assault and heavy keywords, which is quite a nice advantage. I'd say their special weapon is sort of a trade out versus the intercessor's grenade launcher. And overall it just kind of means that the only real draw for the tactical squad is to get 1 heavy weapon in the unit, maybe a las cannon or a multi-melter, which is definitely no bad thing, and perhaps some niche options depending on which sort of characters or transports you might want to combine them with. The Primaris can't use rhinos for example. In general though this seems not to be enough. The heavy weapon you only get 1 per 10, so it sort of dilutes its value versus the smaller squads that you get all those other advantages on. And just in general they seem like a squad that just doesn't really work too much at the moment. I think they need to be genuinely cheaper than their competitors to get much of a look in. Assault intercessors are 150 points per 10, so that seems like the bare minimum for them. I think even then, given the good thing is that the regular intercessors and the assault intercessors get, they might even need to be still cheaper if they're going to be anywhere near competitive with the rules that they have. Realistically, I feel like their datasheet was a bit of a swing and miss in the Codex. I'm not really sure why they're still giving them 1 less attack than the Primaris these days, given that the standard Chaos Marines get the extra attack now. They certainly could have kept their additional special rule in the fallback and shoot type thing. I think that would have given them a bit more of a niche. They do compare kind of hilariously to the Black Templar Firstborn Crusader squad, which is basically these guys but flat better. Plenty more things that maybe could get addressed for the Space Marines though. The Reavers and the Lieutenant maybe also stick out quite a bit. I can't help but think it would be nice to have Terminators actually be considered a genuinely competitive unit a bit more. They see some niche play at the moment but not much more than that, which is maybe a shame given their cool new models. For the Admecha unit I chose to focus on was the Kastelan Robots here. Currently they're 200 points per 2 big clunky robots, plus a Datasmith at 35 points, which is far more worth including nowadays, given that he doesn't have as many drawbacks for the unit and his rules work better. I feel like these were one of the units that could have been better in the initial Codex. They definitely went in the right direction with the Datasmith changes, but it still seems they're not in a place where they can really carry the mainline damage of the codex, at least at a competitive level. You don't really see competitive army lists running these at all. If you want primary damage dealers, it generally tends to be the Kastelan Breachers. These guys don't get a look in, and they are just basically costed a bit high for what they do. They do generally have a bit of an issue with the 40k lack of war gear cost as well. It doesn't really make sense to field these guys without at least one of their power fists, given just the raw value of their melee attacks is so much higher than the ranged attacks. It'd be nice if the shooty version was a bit more viable with those twin phosphor blasters, and then the top phosphor or the Incendiary Combustor. It's either one fist or twin linked fist these days. In general, I think if you wanted to make them competitive, you certainly could just do that with points decreases. I say at the moment they can still do work at a more casual level, they just don't tend to get played in optimised lists. But Games Workshop have made a problem for themselves in the AdMech points cost at the moment. Basically, the last thing that AdMech players want to see is more of their units dropping cost. They're already horrendously expensive at faction to collect, so they don't really want one of the units that's the best bang for their buck in terms of points to also be super cheap to put on the table, as they've already got that in spades in their lighter infantry units. I think in general the wish list for the AdMech players for the data slate will be something that makes their army just a lot more dangerous overall. Maybe a tweak to some basic stat lines or a core special rule, and then if anything their models go up in points while the faction still gains in strength. Otherwise for the Mechanicus, maybe the Rust Stalkers, Belisarius Core and Archaeopters could be ones to look at. I think it would be really quite fun though if the Kastelan Robots could actually enter the ring as a bit more of a mainline damage dealer versus those Cataphrons. For the Tyranids, one unit that kind of went from hero to zero from 9th to 10th were the Tyranid Warriors. Currently 85 points for 3 of them with the melee loadout with the twin linked AP-2 damage, or 70 points per 3 of them with the ranged loadout. Maybe a heavy venom cannon plus a bit of anti-horde shooting, but their attacks are far more focused on killing light infantry if they do get into melee. Since the Tyranids release, the Warriors have just felt a little bit lackluster for the points that you pay, to the extent where again they're kind of rarely seen in competitive lists. And that's not really one of the greatest feelings for a unit that's kind of supposed to be a sort of battle line core unit of the army, even if it doesn't have a technical battle line keyword here. I'd say their damage output isn't really awful for the cost. Certainly the melee version of the Warriors can be fantastically blendy in close combat against virtually any enemy infantry. Mass attacks at AP2 and damage 1 and twin linked can bully most normal sized infantry units, even if they won't be that much threat against tough stuff. I feel like maybe their main issue is durability. For their points cost, their toughness 5, 3 wounds, and only a 4+ armor save. Maybe just a slightly unfortunate profile where basically anything in the game can be really quite effective in terms of shooting at them. Anti-tank stuff is rewarded by killing a fairly valuable elite infantry model, and anti-infantry stuff can easily chip wounds off them. Even things like guard lasguns can be fairly effective against them en masse. In any case, I think it would be really nice if Tyranid Warriors could return as something that you genuinely want at the heart of your army, striding up the battlefield and dealing blows with the enemy's core units. Maybe something like a 5-point decrease on both variants could help get them there if they didn't want to do rules boosts. Otherwise, I feel like maybe just upping their save to a 3+ save might not be the worst, or give them an extra wound or something, just make them a bit more robust to enemy firepower. Otherwise though, there's plenty of units in the Tyranid roster that could use help. The Swarm Lord, the Psychophage, the Spore Assist, the Harpy, and just in general helping out units that might actually threaten the enemy tanks could be kind of handy. That is a kind of weakness of the faction right now. For the Blood Angels, it has been kind of sad to see the Sanguinary Guard sat out of quite so many army lists recently. They're a genuinely very dangerous and threatening unit, mass good melee with lots of attacks at strength 5, AP2 and damage 2, Inferno pistols, and a couple of useful enough defensive rules. They get a -1 to hit in melee and also a -1 to wound in melee if they're with the Warlord. For 175 points though, for just 10 wounds worth of Space Marine, it's just not that great. Any sort of shooting with a bit of AP will whittle them down really quite quickly. And while they do very occasionally see play in the Blood Angels lists, it seems that the order of the day tends to be a lot more Jump Intercessors, Death Company, or even Vanguard Veterans in their lieu, which is maybe a little bit sad for the boys in gold. They should be running along there with Dante and putting the smack down. I don't know if Games Workshop's deliberately trying to keep them niche in some way, to encourage players to mothball them a bit for a Primaris update sometime later in the edition. That's pure speculation there, but I feel like they could afford to give them a small points decrease just to keep them a bit more in line with the other options. I don't think people would necessarily want them to return to the stage that they were in 9th edition, where they were basically the Blood Angels units that everyone spammed maxed amounts of. But I feel like there's probably a happy medium where they're strong but not literally auto-include, and other options are very viable. For the Drukhari, their Hellions stand out as perhaps one of the weaker units in the army right now. maybe compared with just about literally any other datasheet in the index, maybe bar the Razor Wing Jet Fighter, they just feel underwhelming comparatively. These guys are the Witch Cult Skyboarders that zoom around with those big Hellion glaives, and they get a fallback and charge type special rule. Hellions are 85 points for 5 of them. For that you get 5 2 wound toughness 4 bodies with low saves. A 14-inch movement is nice, but the mounted keyword they get means they don't interact with terrain so well, so they'll have to go around things like ruin walls and things. When they get to melee, they get a flurry of attacks at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2. You could opt the AP with a pain token if you wanted, but I feel like not having any leader options and no lance options in melee are both kind of awkward for them. It means that those attacks really are just going to threaten certain profiles but not others. Fairly good against lighter infantry or standard space marines, they're generally going to struggle against things like heavily armoured infantry, and certainly vehicles will usually be able to shrug it off no problem. At the moment they do feel kind of stand out as units that just don't really feel like they've got a good place in the army. If you want a fast moving unit to zoom up the board and be kind of expendable, then Reavers would generally do that better. Being a fair bit cheaper for the nuisance rule is kind of big, given they're only 60 points per unit, plus they move a bit faster and have some scarier shooting. And both of those units might be a bit more niche compared with how they were before, given that they aren't helped out by the Sky Splinter Force, which revolves around transports almost entirely, meaning they really need to get by on their own datasheet strength. And I feel like if you want some more melee damage dealers, you likely want things like Witches or Incubi jumping out of transports and getting lance and things, perhaps more so than Hellions here. I guess they could just give them a points cut if they wanted to. That would probably genuinely help their viability a bit, though I feel like they would have to be really quite cheap before people started picking them up in lieu of more transport goodies. I feel like perhaps Lance on the Charge might not have been too much for their glaives, perhaps seeing as they seem to be functioning as sort of Drukhari cavalry right now. I guess some sort of leader option for the unit would be quite nice. They did have one in the past, I believe. The Drukhari do need quite a lot of models updating in their line just full stop right now. For the Death Guard, one of the units I'd be most tempted to boost would be the Blightlord Terminators. These guys have had a fairly rough time of it since the edition came out. Kind of weird that they're basically unplayed in competitive or optimized armies, despite being 165 points, and that does make them the game's cheapest Terminators per model, at essentially 33 points each. That feels like that should be interesting, at least on paper, given that they're toughness 6, and while they're fairly low threats, they can handle enemy infantry kind of well. The lethal hits does keep them at least somewhat relevant against tougher vehicles and things. I think perhaps their main issue is they've just been solidly eclipsed by Death Shroud ever since 10th edition came out. At 120 points per 3, they're effectively plus 7 points per model, but that flips them from sort of weakish melee with mainly damage 1 attacks to fairly strong melee with those Man Reapers at AP2 and damage 2, also hitting on 2s, and plus their durability doesn't always feel like a direct downgrade versus the Blightlords as well, given that they get that -1 to wound special rule when they've got characters in the unit, which you usually want as the Death Guard Terminator characters are quite good. I did find it really odd that when they did the last balanced data slate, the Death Shroud Terminators went down in cost and the Blightlord stayed as is. It felt like they boosted the wrong Terminator squad, if anything, there. That seems to have only cemented further that the Death Shrouds are the ones to go for in 10th edition, and the Blightlords belong on the shelf. I feel like perhaps the wider context of the army doesn't help them too much either. A fair bit of their value comes in their Plague Combi Bolters, which can cut a slew through enemy hordes if you want, but in general Death Guard don't really seem to be struggling quite as much against lighter infantry targets, and are mainly wanting to cram in as many things that can deal with big tough tanks and heavy targets as they can, which the Death Shroud can be pretty good against, seeing as they've got pretty good melee damage against more or less everything. I feel like ideally they get some sort of rules boost more so than a points decrease, though I feel like that's something that Games Workshop's unlikely to do before the actual Death Guard Codex comes out. Hopefully they have something to make them either just more tanky per model, or a bit more relevant to the army in general when the actual Death Guard Codex does drop. For the Dark Angels, perhaps the single most easy example are the Inner Circle Companions. It was kind of interesting when people saw the leaks on the datasheets, saw the slightly weird AP-1 swords that felt less than you would have expected for them, and then were getting points cost that they'd have to be a bit cheaper than Blade Guard perhaps, maybe around about 85 points or so to be considered somewhat interesting. Then it turned out the points that were printed in the codex were 105 points. I was fully expecting Games Workshop to issue different points costs when the digital download came, but they chose to keep them at that exact value. Overall, that basically means that you got 105 points for 3 wound marines. They do get a -1 to hit if they've got a character in the unit, though that's not the biggest protection in the world. They lack an invulnerable save, they only have AP -1 weapons, even if they do get some fun variant stances. And what's more, they seem to have supplanted the company heroes in the options for Dark Angel's characters to lead, so in some ways might have reduced their options for what units they can field in their army, or at least if you wanted Azrael to run with the command squad. I feel like if they did want them at 105 points, they might need a bit more AP on those blades. That'd be a good start at least. It might not even be too much to put them up to 4 wounds per model like the company heroes. Between those two, that might be just about enough if they are going to charge them at 35 points per model, which is really quite a lot. In general, Games Workshop don't tend to make changes to datasheets like that in balance passes, unless it's really quite big pivotal ones that are sort of key to the army's functioning, like the Grey Knights, Dread Knights. So I think that what's more likely to happen is a solid points cut. I feel like 85 points or below will be the place to start, even if you're just literally comparing against Blade Guard veterans, which even then I kind of rate them as a usable unit for Space Marines, but aren't really at the point where they're standout or considered commonplace in competitive lists right now. The Inner Circle Companions are certainly far from the only Dark Angels unit that needs help though. The vast majority of their codex could probably afford to either have rules boosts or points cuts. For the Guard, the unit to maybe zero in on might be the Valkyrie. Games Workshop does seem to have been in a bit of a mission in 10th edition to try and keep flyer choices pretty niche, maybe in the position where they're usable casually, but for the most part don't feature in optimized competitive lists. I think the majority of people would prefer them just to be balanced so they're usable and interesting, but most lists choose not to spam them. Though if that isn't to be the case, then maybe they aren't the worst units to keep a little bit more niche than some. I feel like the Valkyrie for the Imperial Guard maybe fills a bit of a different role though. It's always been generally a bit more of a flying transport than a big threat in its own right. I think it's unlikely to be any sort of problem unit, even if it was a fairly decent buy-in in the Guard army that's otherwise really quite well balanced in my opinion. The current deal that you have for it is 190 points, which is really quite a big ask for a flying transport that's going to be transporting something that's far less valuable than itself. Never mind just the raw numbers are kind of underwhelming. Its defensive profile is fairly tanky for a flyer, but not really all that much to write home about at 190 points, kind of fairly comparable with things like Lehman Russ Demolishers that are far more threat. The damage output for the points is poor, though you'd kind of expect that for a transport, and the main draw is to zoom one unit up the board for an alpha strike, move 20 inches and disembark and get to shoot. Though given that you can deliver units really quite well with a Chimera for just 70 points, which is a very efficient little transport, it's just hard to see in what world the Valkyrie justifies being 120 points more than the Chimera, for what I consider to be only a kind of slight increase in utility really. Even its special rule doesn't really give it much of a saving grace, potentially using rapid ingress in the opponent's turn for free for a unit jumping out of it pretty much. Occasionally that could be handy to maybe get things like melter guns into melter range, that really depends on your opponent moving units in a really specific way. Not so close that they'd stop the unit from getting out, but also not so far away that your unit won't be able to strike them after it's jumped out in the enemy turn. Overall, could probably afford to be significant less points than this. They were quite cheap in editions past, more like the 130 sort of point mark, and I feel like that kind of price tag genuinely wouldn't be unreasonable for it now. I suspect that even then you'd still see more people using Chimeras versus Valkyries. Otherwise for the Guard, I don't think they have it too bad for internal balance versus most armies right now. Perhaps the Death Strike missile launcher could be one to look at, maybe Rough Riders, though I have seen them played occasionally. I do think it would be kind of nice to have not every single army start by building fully around Lord Solar Leontus, though I feel like that's probably not going to happen without a big points hike to him, which might not be that ideal given that for most players Guard have a win rate of around about 45% competitively, sort of on the lower side for the majority of people trying to make them work in a comp environment. For the Gene Stealer cult, the Magus has been the datasheet that just really stands out as being underwhelming compared with the rest for quite a while. Their primary character support piece was generally really quite strong back in 9th edition. It's 50 points now for a model that just rarely does anything all that meaningful. You get a 5+ feel no pain against psyche attacks, which is useful against a select few armies, and even then not to the point where it's particularly game changing against them. And then the core rule is the mind control debuff, a -1 to hit at the start of the enemy shooting phase. Normally you can only target it on enemy units within 12 inches, so they need to have moved up their squads right up close to you. Once per game you can make it more useful and push it out to 24. The only good part of the rule is that on a 6 you can actually prevent the enemy unit from shooting, which could be absolutely massive in the right circumstances, but having that happen only 1 out of every 6 times is just not very reliable whatsoever. It's just not something that you can plan on happening at all, and generally seen as not worth the gamble even if you manage to get that rule off on meaningful units multiple turns running, which given the low range on most turns is kind of unlikely to happen. It doesn't help that the Magus is competing against a fairly huge cast of various supporting options, and it probably just needs a rules rewrite more so than a points change. Fingers crossed Games Workshop might make them a bit more interesting in the Genestealer Cult Codex, which is coming this summer. Otherwise, for the cults, perhaps the Metamorphs and Rock Grinder could be ones to look at. They don't really see that much competitive play themselves. Maybe it could be more the case of a small points tweak as opposed to needing to completely redesign the datasheet or anything, though anything that they did change in the codex to make them more interesting would be nice. Finally, at least for the examples from this video, I've done a slight cop-out with the Death Watch, not picked one units, but basically just said all Primaris kill teams I think could afford to go down a fair bit. Alongside the core Space Marines that aren't using Divergent chapters, they've got a competitive win rate of around about 42% currently. Pretty much the weakest army in the game, and the fact that they're not out-competing the core Codex Marines despite adding a bunch of units to the mix is kind of telling really. It just shows that none of their unique units are particularly strong. As their entire roster of squads, the Proteus kill teams, the Veterans and the Terminators all feel okay-ish, but in general I rate them as more sort of fairly costed rather than stand out in their own right. And pretty much all the Primaris kill teams I feel like can be interesting enough if you build around them with big combinations of stratagems, character buffs and enhancements. But it feels like even if you've gone for an entire detachment to play around one of those units, it still only gets to the point of just about being alright and usable as opposed to actually stand out, which is what it really needs to be if you're trying to go for centerpiece units like that. The big weird mixed units can make some interesting combos, but they do come with downsides as well, basically needing to include a full 10 models in the unit, which isn't enormously flexible in Space Marine terms, and just their lack of use in tournaments and things at the moment shows they're not really in a place where they need to be. I think all the Primaris kill teams could afford to drop a bit, and then Games Workshop can reassess where they are after they've seen whether or not people take them at the new lower points cost. It did seem kind of strange how much Deathwatch got passed over for any sort of balance changes in the last update. In any case, let me know what you think though. That's just a quick shortlist of 10 units I'd be most tempted to buff in Warhammer 40k. Certainly not exhaustive, and there's plenty of other things beyond that, but I'll certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts on any others. What are the hopes for your given army in the balanced data slate? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.